It's unbelievably, overwhelmingly powerful. She got kids to read 600-page books, like multiple volumes lining up for them. You got to ask yourself why. Silly stories about magical orphans. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe people aren't so stupid. And certainly if they happen to be reading relatively complex books, attributing that to stupidity seems to be rather counterproductive. All right, so that's the chaotic domain. Now, we got to think about the chaotic domain for a minute. The chaotic domain is where you don't know what's going to happen. And anything could happen, positive or negative. Anything can happen. And so you can think about the chaotic domain as the birthplace of order. It's the place from which order emerges. Well, it's akin in some sense. Remember what happens in Pinocchio. So Pinocchio goes down into the depths and then into the whale to rescue his father. He goes to the most frightening place possible. And he tests himself against it. And he rescues his father and he brings him up to the surface. But the consequence of that is that he dies. But what dies is the stupid puppet. And so the question is, well, to the degree that you're a stupid puppet, are you willing to let that die? And the answer to that is, it depends on the degree to which you're actually a stupid puppet. Because the more that's true, the more of you has to die. And it's not something trivial. That's why these myths insist upon the horror of the thing that lurks, so to speak, is that that death might be enough to actually kill you if you're not properly prepared for it. And that's what happens to people who are extraordinarily traumatized, for example. It's like huge parts of them are killed, and they often don't recover. So it's no joke. Well, and then of course this is often acted out in the real world too. If, you know, this can happen on a psychological basis. And so your own psychological experiences can be enough to radically disrupt and hurt you. But it can be worked out in the real world too, because if you're wandering around naively with your eyes closed and you run into someone who's really psychopathic, they'll take you apart and you'll have no defense against it whatsoever because you're too blind and naive. And if you encounter someone like that and they leave you in the ashes, which they might, it's certainly possible that you'll never recover from it. You just will not be able to handle the aftermath, but also you won't be able to handle the fact that something like that could actually happen. And that's really the nature of trauma. You cannot believe that that could actually happen. And that's an encounter, it's almost always, and this has been the case, certainly been my clinical experience. What traumatizes people is malevolence. It's not tragedy, although tragedy can traumatize people if it's severe enough. But generally, no, people can withstand tragedy. They are done in by real malevolence. And so sometimes it's the realization of their own malevolence that does them in. But when that isn't the case, they encounter someone who's out there in the world who's actually operating to hurt them. And so, and if the person is psychopathic enough, and this is actually goes beyond pure psychopathy, because at least the psychopath has the sense to be self-interested. You can go far farther than that, where you're perfectly willing to hurt yourself as long as you hurt the other person at the same time. And that's where you go when you're doing something like conjuring up the idea that you might shoot up a school, because those people always kill themselves at the end. And you might think, well, why don't they just save everyone a lot of trouble and kill themselves at the beginning? Well, that wouldn't exactly be the point, would it? What they want to say is, life means nothing to me, nothing. But I'm perfectly willing to make as many people as I possibly can suffer before I demonstrate that. And so that's a step past psychopathy. And if you encounter that in someone, or in yourself, that's going to be a deeply unsettling experience. And the idea behind many of these stories is that you cannot figure out what to do about that before you have an encounter like that. And if you think about that properly, that's as horrifying an experience as you can imagine, right? It's precisely that. It's as horrifying an experience as you can imagine. So, all right, so back. This chaos, this is the birthplace of things. That's why often it's represented as feminine, because feminine things are the birthplace of things. Now again, you know, people are stuck with the necessity of interpreting their experience through the biological platform of interpretation that they evolved. And so we could say, well, we recognize feminine, we recognize masculine, we recognize parent, we recognize child, and that's ancient, right? That's as ancient as mammals. And so those are fundamental social cognitive categories. And we had to exploit those categories to represent the world beyond that when we started to be able to represent the world beyond that. Just as a primate, like a chimpanzee or a tree-dwelling primate, a complex primate, almost all of their categories are social cognitive. Right? Why? Because they live in complex social environments, and there's a relationship between the size of the social environment that a primate inhabits and its brain size. The bigger the brain, the larger the environment. And you could think there's a loop there, right? If your brain's too small, you can't handle the larger environment. So the environment grows and it selects for creatures that are complex enough to compute the environment, and then that gives a selective advantage to creatures that are acute or are sharp enough to compute the environment, and so there's more of them, and it loops, and the brain grows. I mean, it's not the only thing driving the evolution of the brain among primates, but it's a primary source. So we have those categories to begin with, and then we have to view the world as it manifests itself outside those primary categories through the lens of those categories. And so what happens is we use the symbolism of sex differentiation and the symbolism of parent-child relationships to begin to account for the manner in which the world manifests itself. Masculine. Why? Well, that's the patriarchy. Chaos. Feminine. Why? Well, partly it's conceived of in opposition to the patriarchy, but more importantly, it's the thing from which order rises. So it's perfectly reasonable to consider it feminine. And then order again. And then the question is, well, you have order, father, chaos, mother. And then you have this transformational process. Well, that's the mythological hero. And those are the three fundamental characters of mythology. Individual, culture, nature, right? It's the universal world. And then that's differentiated further. Positive individual, negative individual, hero and adversary, tyrant and wise king, the destructive element of nature and the creative element of nature. And those are perfectly reasonable categories. They do a lovely job of actually representing how the world does manifest itself to us in the domains that are permanent. There's always a conscious observer who's ambivalent about the nature of the world. There's always a social structure that's half tyrannical and half order producing. And there's always the nature that gives rise to everything and that destroys it at the same time. Always. It's permanent. And so that's another reason, it's so interesting, that's another reason why the mythological representations are hyper real. Because you think, what makes something real? Let's say protons are real. Why? Because at one level of analysis, every single thing is made out of protons. So you can use it as an explanatory tool, the concept, you can use it as an explanatory tool for every possible situation, and it's true across all possible spans of time, although protons do decay, but it takes billions and billions of years. So real means works now, and works forever, applies now, and applies everywhere. Well, that's exactly what this map means. It's that there's always an observer, there's always a framework of interpretation, and there's always that which is being observed. There's always the individual, there's always the social environment, the dominance hierarchy. And there's always the nature that exists outside of that. There's always the knower, the known, and the unknown. Always. So then the question is, well, how do those things interrelate? Well, you differentiate them into their positive and negative elements, because there's always the positive and negative element, and then you tell stories about how the different categories interact. And that's what the stories do. And the more mythological the story, the more that underlying schema is self-evident in the plot. And you especially see that, I think, in stories for children. And maybe that's because children can't understand stories unless they're archetypal. Like blatantly archetypal. And that would make sense, right? Because the stories have to appeal to the instinctive knowledge of the child, or the child wouldn't be able to comprehend them. And so, you know, I saw this quite dramatically with my own kids, watching them watch Disney movies, for example. My son was absolutely obsessed with Pinocchio. and particularly obsessed with the scene where Pinocchio and his father are escaping from the whale, and the whale turns into this sort of smoke belching locomotive thing that's chasing them through the water. He would rewind that and watch it, and rewind it and watch it, and rewind it and watch it, like over and over and over. And you think, what the hell's that kid up to? Well, you know, it took us, what, 6 hours to do a brief run through Pinocchio, still by still. There's a lot of information in that movie, a tremendous amount of information. And then what the kid's trying to do is to incorporate it, to understand it, to embody it. And that's all happening in some sense, I would say, unconsciously. It's like it's unconscious in that he couldn't articulate what he was doing, and neither could anyone else. But that doesn't mean he wasn't doing something. He was definitely doing something. He was doing the same thing that enabled my nephew to put on the knight suit when he did that, the little knight hat and the sword, and figure out how to go after the great dragon of chaos. And so I want to tell you a little bit more about this idea of chaos. So here's the schema. You have the archetypal sun, and we'll get to why it's masculine and not feminine. And that's also taken me a long time to crack, because the women in this class have always asked me, well, the hero in mythological stories is male, where does that leave women? And I never knew what to say about that exactly. You can look at Sleeping Beauty, for example, that story. And Sleeping Beauty is rescued by a prince. And you can think of that prince at two levels of analysis simultaneously. You can think about it as an actual male who plays that role, but you can also think about it as the exploratory, assertive, and courageous part of the feminine psyche that's necessary to bring unconsciousness up into consciousness. And the story works perfectly across both those levels of analysis. And that is the classic way, I would say, of explaining this particular mode of representation. But it came to my attention, this was so interesting, this is what triggered this for me finally. I was reading this book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts, that was written by a bunch of engineers at Google, and they were looking at billions of Google searches. And you know, there's no shortage of pornography on the internet, and there's much less by proportion than there was when the internet was first invented. And it's so interesting because it actually turned out that one of the things that drove the development of the internet and the technology was the proclivity of young men to search out sexually provocative images. That was what was at the forefront of the development of the net. It's extraordinarily interesting. They were motivated to use it for that purpose, and that provided the platform from which it emerged. Amazing. Anyways, the Google engineers looked at pornographic search processes and then segregated male searches from female searches, and what they found was that the males searched out images. Surprise, surprise, no one considers that, you know, particularly interesting, but the females searched out literary representations of pornography. It was written. And so I can give you an example of that. If you know about Harlequin romances, does everybody still know about those? Anybody not know about those? Okay, well, they're mass market romances, and of a very stereotypical type. And the original ones were pretty harmless in terms of no violence and no real sexual content. But that was 40 years ago, and they've differentiated tremendously, and now there's hardcore Harlequin romances, and with particularly garish covers, and then there's the old, you know, more tame, basic, sexless and aggressionless romances where everything is implied and not explicit, but the explicit ones exist. So they did a plot analysis of the typical pornographic female fantasy. Well, and it's so comical because engineers did this, and social scientists would never do this because they'd be probably too concerned about the ethics of it or some damn thing. But engineers, you know, they'll just plow ahead with no concern whatsoever for such things, and they actually discover things that way. And so they discovered the basic plot of the female pornographic literary product. And they identified, so basically what happened was that a innocent, well-meaning, and attractive young woman encounters a male who's a bit of a monster. And the monster, there's 5 types of classic male monster. For all you males who want to know, this is what you can become. Vampire, that's a good one. Werewolf, billionaire, pirate, and surgeon. Okay, so that's very interesting because well, first of all, there's a dominance thing. Now you're actually blushing, you know, you're actually blushing about that. That's very, very funny. So, sorry to point it out, but it's so comical, you know.